This time we're going to look at the world of flowers. Flowers, like human beings, come in two types, male and female. And like human beings, they have to meet together in order to produce another generation of flowers. The male and the female have to come together in some way. And it's obvious, isn't it, that every generation of plants and animals and flowers too must reproduce itself before it dies. Otherwise, there won't be any more plants and animals. There won't be any more flowers. And it's somehow mixing genetic material from a male with that from a female gives you much more opportunity in the offspring to have improved quality, resistance to disease, opportunity to be varied according to the changes of conditions that occur. So the offspring, whether it's animals or fish or flowers, end up with genes from both their parents mixed together. And that's the most efficient way of reproduction. Okay, now in animals, of course, there's no problem. In fish and insects, all that happens is the male and the female move together, they find each other, and they mate. Away we go, like this. Characteristic human couple found each other. Lions found themselves a partner. Even the fish down in the coral sea have found partners. But when it comes to trees and flowers, they can't move. They can't physically join themselves up with a partner of the opposite sex. So the big question is, how can the male and the female meet? That's what we got to solve. How can that happen? Well, plants and trees have two amazing methods they use to connect the males with the females. One is to use pollen that's blown by the winds from the male to the female. And the other way is to use insects to carry the pollen from the male to the female. Let's have a look at the wind as the pollen carrier. All plants pack their male genetic material, the DNA, into tiny little capsules, which we call pollen. And these are very small, 0.05 millimeters in size, 5 to 9 microns to be scientific, just like dust, very fine dust. Okay, so that's the pollen size. And each of those grains of pollen is full of the chromosomes of the male plant. There's strings of DNA that we read about, that genetic code, which enshrines the appearance and the characteristics of that male plant are all there. Here's a classic picture of the DNA helix with all those records of the contents of that particular cell. We know, of course, it's arranged as a helix to save space, and inside the DNA, inside the chromosomes, the DNA is packed tight to go off on its journey. So the pollen grain is packed full of the chromosomes, which are full of the DNA, which enshrine the characteristics of that particular male plant. Okay, what about the female trees? Well, generally, trees also are male or female, like flowers. And when their pollen is wind-blown, the flowers they produce are very small. They don't have a strong smell. They're not brightly coloured. They're very plain. But for wind-blown pollen, the female trees have small sticky pads on their structure, which are called the stigmas. And these trap the flying pollen that comes in from a male tree that could be a mile away, it could be many thousands of kilometers away. And when it lands, the male pollen sends its chromosomes down to mix with the female chromosomes. That fertilizes the female plant, and so the seeds which that tree will produce are ready to go. It's a diagram. So that's the place where the baby seed is going to be. These are the pollen grains which have flown in on the sky, and this is the female stigma. You can see the pollen grains have already germinated, they're starting to sprout and go down into this part here, where they mix the male DNA with the female DNA of the stigma to produce the ovule down there below. Here's a lovely photograph of different grains of pollen from different trees and grasses. You can see some of them have little spikes, some of them have little wings, and they're all made for traveling through the air. So if this plant we're talking about relies on the wind to carry the pollen around to another plant, we know that pollen has to be very light in weight because it has to travel big distances, very light in weight. In fact, often it has little wings that help it to fly along in the air currents through the atmosphere. Here's a classic picture of what a male hazel looks like. A male hazel tree looks like in spring. We can see the grains of pollen beginning to fall like dust on these catkins that we rejoice to see because we know that spring's coming. Here's the oak tree, the English oak tree, which also spreads its seed by its pollen by the wind. Here's a photograph of oak tree pollen, quite distinctive. Up in Scotland, the Scots pine in the mountains also produces pollen. Now, this definitely has little wings, as you can see, to help it travel. Well, the target, the female receptor, is very tiny. It's only around 1 millimeter in diameter, and it could be anywhere on a tree. And that tree could be anywhere in the countryside. So the chance of one pollen grain hitting one stigma is microscopically small, very small chance. Because it could be many kilometers between the male and the female tree, and the pollen's only 1 millimeter in diameter, and the target it's looking for is very tiny. There we go. So the answer is each tree, whether it's an oak tree or a Scots pine or a hazel, of those types that spread their pollen by the wind, have to actually saturate the whole sky with pollen. They have to send out millions of pollen grains in the hope that one or two will land up on a female receptor. Now, it's an interesting point. Anywhere in the UK, you take a tablecloth, a metre by a metre, and put it on the ground and leave it there for a year. At the end of a year, it would have been covered with 5 million oak pollen grains, just oak pollen grains on your tablecloth anywhere in the UK. 5 million of them. And that's how it builds up the chances of the male one actually reaching a female one anywhere in the countryside. So here's the pollen coming around onto our tablecloth, and there's at least 2 that have found the receptor that we're looking for. Now, other species, of course, not just oak trees and Scots pine and hazel, other species doing the same thing. Obviously, only oak pollen will fertilise an oak tree. Other trees have to fill the air with their pollen as well. That's why in the springtime in the UK, the air is full of these almost invisible pollen grains from different trees all at the same time. And so it's no wonder, is it, that some people suffer from hay fever because of this huge barrage of flying pollen that fills the air in the spring. And why does this happen in the spring? Well, of course, in the spring, the trees haven't yet got their leaves. So the leaves don't get in the way of the pollen making its way through the branches to find its target. And also, of course, in the spring, early spring at least, it's usually quite windy, which helps to carry the pollen along. And it's known that the pollen from Scots pines have been found, for example, in islands right out in the Atlantic, thousands of kilometres away from Scotland. That's how amazing this system is for spreading the pollen in the wind. Now we need to move on to the other type of flower or tree that uses insects to carry its pollen from male to female. Trees and grasses, all the grasses use wind to carry pollen, but some plants, particularly flowers, persuade the insects to carry their pollen for them. And the way they do that is to reward the insect with a sweet nectar as its prize. And these types of flowers are constructed so that if it wants to reach the nectar right down in the bottom of the flower, it has to brush past the male pollen holders, the stamens. And that pollen will stick to the body of the insect when it comes out. So here's a diagram of a typical flower. Here's the ovule, like we saw in the wind-blown pollen. There's the ovule, eventually where the seed will be. There's the sticky stigma, females, receptors, and the pollen from on the stamens of this plant will be carried by an insect to another flower of the same type, and the pollen will be carried down by the insect into the flower and get deposited on the what's this? There we go. To be deposited on those stigma down at the bottom of the flower. Because you see, in the case of these flowers, they can be male and female at the same time. They can produce both pollen for the insects to carry, and they have the ovule to make the future seed. Here's a lovely picture from our garden of a bumblebee busy tucking itself away in the heart of a flower. This diagram shows that what is happening is the bee, and here's its long tongue, proboscis, which goes right down to the bottom of the flower where the nectar is, and in doing so, the pollen here from the male stamens dust themselves onto the body of the bee. And here's a photograph of the bee. It's obviously been busy this day, visiting lots of flowers, and it's actually covered with the dust of pollen. So when it visits a similar flower, in order to reach the nectar in the second flower, it has to brush against the female receptors, and then the pollen grains from the first flower stick to the stigma of the second flower, and it becomes fertilized. And that's how the plant can overcome the problem that it can't move. It pays insects to do the work for it. So there's the pollen grains landing on the stigma and fertilizing it, and then it produces the eggs, the seed down below, which eventually we shall plant in the ground. But of course, as we said, oak pollens will only fertilize oak trees, it won't fertilize other trees. So it is with the flowers. It's no good putting the pollen from a daisy into a dandelion. It won't fertilize it. So the flower needs the insects immediately to recognize the kind of flower it's just visited and where it had a good feed of super nectar. It has to go from flower to flower of the same species if this is going to work. Dandelion pollen only fertilizes dandelion flowers and daisies and so on. So the insect has to identify dandelions if that's the one it's working on today. Well, there's different ways the flowers make themselves very strongly marked to these flying insects. They have distinctive colours, of course. They have their own smells, individual smells, and they have characteristic shapes as well. So even flying above the field from a distance, the insect can see the right shape of flower. It goes down a bit. It recognises the colour of the flower. Yes, that's the one I need today. It gets really close, and it can actually smell the scent from the flowers. Yes, I've definitely got the right one here, and it dives in to get the nectar. And so if you had a good feed of nectar from one flower, you know how to find another one of the same species. And you see here some of the identifications. Colour, different colours, red, blue, yellow here, orange. Shape, a bluebell shape compared with a tulip shape. And of course the smell. Roses have obviously a different smell to violets and anemones. So there we are. Here's a beautiful picture of a large daisy. You can see the pollen part here, ready for the bees to brush against as they go down to find the nectar. Here's a classic English rose, which of course has been bred to be very large and very colourful and having a beautiful scent by human beings, but even the wild rose attracts its insects in the same way. There's a gorgeous hibiscus from a tropical country with very bright colours. And back in the UK, in our back garden in the springtime, we find the peacock butterfly has found its way to the grape hyacinth, and it's busy munching its way into the nectar there. Daffodils, of course, come up in the spring. And that's another point. These flowers have different seasons in which to come up with their pollen. If all the flowers came out at the same time, like daffodils, grape hyacinths, and tulips, and clover, if they all came out at the same time, there'd never be enough insects to fertilize them. to go around all those flowers. So the flowers take it in turns. They each have a different time of year to flower. If you're in the UK, the order will be something like this: daffodils in the spring, dandelions that would follow, apple blossom would come after that, clover would come out in the summer, in July and August, chrysanthemums would flower in the autumn. And it's a strict order every year. We can almost tell what time of year it is by looking at the fields and as we drive along in our car. So here's March with the daffodils, and we move on to May with the fruit blossoms. July, we have the clover in the fields, and then in the autumn, we have the chrysanthemums. It's their time to flower. We go back to March and go around again. So it's a case of mutual benefit. The flowers use the insects to pollinate their flowers and get the next generation going, but the insects on their part gain the nectar and pollen that they need to feed their young. Actually, I should have mentioned that perhaps the pollen is actually used, if it's got protein, it's used with the nectar as well to feed the babies of the insects. Isn't that wonderful? So there's a mutual benefit. It goes both ways. Okay, time to think about the implications of all this. It's very hard to explain by evolution how trees will begin to send their DNA to each other by the wind. How does that very light pollen grain come about that can travel enormous distances blown along by the wind? How do some trees have these sticky receptor pads, but they're female only, as opposed to other trees which produce the pollen, which are male only? And what happened in the early stages, millions of years ago, when there were only tiny quantities of pollen produced, not enough to blanket the countryside? How did the trees manage to reproduce? Because it's only a matter of chance, isn't it, that one pollen grain finds a female flower. Plants are supposed to have evolved millions of years before the insects came along. So how did the flowers develop nectar and colour and very distinctive shapes, even when there were no insects there to fertilise them? It doesn't really make sense. And what did the insects live on before the nectar came along, before the flowers decided they need to produce a sugary reward for the flying nectar pollen carriers? And even more interesting, who decided the order of flowering in different months? Did all the flowers get together in a sort of conference and say, right, dandelions, how about that? You go first. Who wants to go next? And so the clover put up their hands. It can't be like that, can it? Flowers can't speak. They can't think. And there is a very definite order of flowering all the way around the clock. And once again, we feel as Bible students, it's easier to believe in an intelligent designer who built those insects and plants to work in harmony together in his amazing capacity to design and build things. He designed trees that cannot move but use flying pollen to reach other trees along their way. Here's what it says in that first chapter of Genesis. God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so, each according to its kind. Separations between the oak trees and Scots pines and hazel, they're not all the same. They have their own kind, and they go on reproducing. Well, you may remember in one of his speeches, Jesus says, if God takes such care over the lilies of the field, surely he's going to look after us, his highest creation. Look at the lilies of the field, he says, how they grow. They don't work. They don't make their clothing. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not dressed as beautifully as they are. If God cares so wonderfully for wildflowers that are here today, thrown into the fire tomorrow, says Jesus, he will certainly care for you. So we have to trust in this wonderful creator who made all these wonderful designs. Let's summarize. The pollination of flowers by wind demands vast numbers of airborne pollen grains so that at least a few of them will get through to their target. On the other hand, insect pollination requires a bait, the nectar, and a sequence of flowering times all around the year so that the bees know which ones to work in March and which ones to work in April and May. And we would say, in both cases, a brilliant designer must have been involved. And that designer, says Jesus, will take care of all our worries. All we have to do is to believe. Well, once again, thanks for listening, and I hope we'll see you again soon.